Over the past 7 years, I've interviewed at more than 20 companies. And out of all of the on-sites I've done, I've only ever been rejected from one. And I've also earned offers from giant companies like Meta, Amazon, Google, and many others. Here's a guide to the steps I followed to ace those interviews. The first step, and this one starts months before you actually start interviewing, is to build a solid foundation. Preparation should begin months before you start applying. School and work will rarely cover everything you need to know to actually successfully pass these technical interviews. So you need to make sure that you grasp the fundamentals. These fundamentals can typically be divided into 2 parts: knowing about system design and knowing how to pass the coding interviews. Let's go over coding interviews first. If you're early in your career, coding interviews will dominate your process. Typically, you'll have 1 or 2 phone screens, which are 45 minutes to an hour long interviews, all about coding, followed by a couple more of these during your on-sites, where you might have 3, 4, or 5 interviews in a single day. These interviews involve solving some algorithmic problem, usually in a 45 to 60 minute period. You want to make sure that you showcase your ability to actually code through a working solution, make sure you cover edge cases, and ideally provide a solution that's fairly optimal. To be successful, one of the first things you need to do is pick a single programming language that you want to master. Get so comfortable with it that you don't even have to think about the syntax of this programming language. Because during a coding interview, there are so many other parts that you need to think about. You don't want to be using brain space to figure out how you should be initializing an array. This leads right into the second thing you want to make sure you know, which is your data structures and how to implement them in that programming language. Make sure you understand how arrays work, linked lists, stacks, queues, trees, graphs, heaps, and hash tables. You want to be able to create these. You want to be able to parse through data that's stored in these structures, and you want to know how to manipulate them. Once you have a good grasp of these concepts, you want to start practicing problems. Platforms like LeetCode and HackerRank are invaluable for your practice. Typically, they'll have questions that mirror, in some respects, the type of questions you'll see in these interviews. And they'll have difficulty levels so that you can get started with easier problems and slowly work your way up to more complicated problems that you might see in more advanced interviews. You can also find curated lists like Grind75 or Blind75 on the internet that give you a list of questions that you might want to solve from these platforms to get good coverage on all of the different types of questions that show up in interviews. You want to dedicate time daily. It's definitely worth it. And even if you can't do it every day, make sure that you spend a couple of hours each week practicing the problems. In a 45-minute interview, sometimes it's really hard to get through these questions unless you've seen something similar before. Next, we're going to tackle system design interviews. For intermediate or senior roles, there's typically at least one of these in your interview loop. System design rounds test your ability to create scalable, reliable, and efficient solutions to a more organized piece of software that you might want to deploy. You'll discuss broad scenarios, like how to build a video streaming platform like YouTube, or manage users in a platform that has 3 billion users spread out across the world. Some of the key areas that you need to go over are understanding how you scale systems so that it can handle millions of users and lots of data throughput. And you also want to make sure that your data is consistent and available for everyone in the world. You want to also be able to discuss the trade-off between the latency of your system, the throughput of your system, and how reliable you can make it. Through all of this, your communication skills matter as much, if not even slightly more, than your technical ability. You want to express your thought process clearly, and definitely don't hesitate to ask clarifying questions. In system design interviews, the initial problem given to you is typically vague, and you're expected to narrow it down to a concrete set of goals that you want to achieve with your system. Then you want to be able to explain your thought process as you're building out your whole system. This interview is a little bit harder because there's usually not a single correct solution. It's about your ability to think through the problem, figure out multiple approaches, and figure out which approach would work best for the scenario you're given. Something that's fairly close to real life, except in real life, you're not building out an entire YouTube system in 45 minutes. Beyond the system design and coding interviews, there's also another type of interview that I see many people struggle with, and that is the behavioral interview. You know how to code. You've demonstrated your ability to build out systems. But can you communicate your strengths and weaknesses? In this interview, you have to demonstrate that you're a mature enough person to work in an environment with other adults and be able to responsibly communicate with them. You want to prepare examples from your real life that reflect and showcase some of the important skills that you have in these areas. You want to make sure that these examples align with the role and the type of people you're expected to interact with on a daily basis. But most importantly, you want to follow the STAR method to explain each of these scenarios. If you're asked about a time where you had to handle conflict with your supervisor, you want to be able to express the situation you were in great detail. Then you want to describe what the actual task was, followed by the action you took to resolve that task, and finally, the result it achieved. So if you had a disagreement with your supervisor about an approach that you were trying, you want to state that situation, the actual goal you were trying to achieve, the actions you took to come to an agreement with your supervisor, and then what did that result in. You can rehearse this type of interview by writing down a set of scenarios from your experience that reflects and highlights some of your soft skills, and keep track of them so that in an interview, if you're asked about any of these scenarios, you don't have to think back about an example from a long time ago. In a nervous interview setting, it's a lot harder to figure out what to say than if you had thought about it ahead of time, and then you can bring it to the interview and highlight your best self. Breaking into tech is challenging. Nowadays, it can take months of applying, practicing, and refining. Recruiters aren't knocking on your door every 2 days to try to get you to interview for a company. They're filtering people out as much as possible because companies are looking for the best of the best, or what they think is the best of the best. But if you master your fundamentals, practice consistently, and learn from every interview experience that you have, success will eventually follow. Stay resilient and eventually you will get that offer.